All right. Well, you set me up perfectly, Colin. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So, you just talked about how we are living in these times of incredible polarization and division. And you and I were talking the other night about how, as if it weren't bad enough that these multi-billion-dollar global media companies and political propaganda organizations were doing everything in their power to divide us and to fill our brains with things that make it impossible for us to talk to each other. We're also burrowing down into our own holes and hiding from each other, even when those forces aren't operating. And so I want to ask you, what happens when we lose interest and curiosity about each other? What happens when we ignore each other in the spaces that we share, like this space here, or out on the sidewalk, walking through a park, standing in line at the grocery store? What happens when we lose interest in each other? And what might happen if we tried to do the opposite, if we tried to repair the cables?
Thank you. Okay, so...
What? Can you not hear me? Now can you hear me now?
Did you get the question I got back? So I took this bicycle journey in 1986, before most of you were born, or before some of you were born, actually. No, but 1986, there's a few people here that, all right, before two of you were born. And the reason I got on the bicycle was because I couldn't write the story that I wanted to write. But I was only, at that stage I was only 21, right? And I come from Ireland, I was a journalist, and I thought I was going to write a novel a la Kerouac, a la Burroughs, a la Ginsberg. And I bought myself a typewriter and a big roll of paper because I didn't want to be Kerouac, and I fed it through, and the A key didn't work and the E key didn't work. And when I read what I had written at the end of the summer, it was complete and utter shite. And I said to myself, well, I can go back to my newspaper. Or I can do something that doesn't necessarily compute. Although I wasn't entirely this conscious at that stage, I was like, fuck it, I want to do something. Right? That's more or less what I was thinking. I ended up getting on a bicycle, and I spent the best part of the next 2 years on a bicycle, going from one coast to the other, as I said to you earlier. And in the process of that journey, I learned the value of listening. And I thought I'd found the secret code. Because a lot of people would come up to me and they'd look at me, and I was there with 2 pannier bags on the back of the bike, 2 pannier bags in the front, tent and sleeping bag. I slept out every night, more or less, for a year and a half, in the forests and by rivers and camps and people's backyards. And they would say to me, what are you doing? But within about 5-10 minutes, they would always start telling me their story. And I was talking to the kids in school about this today, and one of the things that was beautiful about that was I began to learn the value of listening. Now, let's fast forward to today, when it seems to me that we're not listening to each other in the way that your question would suggest, and I think it's pretty obvious. There are these massive divides, and there are these huge gulfs, canyons. You would understand the topographical metaphor better than I would, living where you do. There are massive divides between us. So what is it that we can do to go across those divides and to find one another? Well, I actually think that it's part of the original equation, and that is stories and storytelling, and that we need to be able to not only tell our own story, which is fine. It's great to be able to tell our own story. But as Edward Abbey, who spent some time in these parts, would have said, sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. And really what we have to do is not only tell our story, but to listen to the stories of others, and then to possibly turn those stories into some form of proper action on the ground, get stuff done.
Cool. So speaking of stories, you mentioned some of the people that you have written about over the years, and looking over your work as I was preparing for this, I'm just amazed by the diversity and breadth of your characters and the subjects that you write about, and then even within those particular stories, the way that you find a paragon of ways to get at them. That book, A Paragon, completely blew me out of the water. I haven't recovered from reading it, and I think I read it right when it came out. So just to run down the list again, your characters include a half-Irish, half-Mexican photographer piecing together his parents' multinational love story, a Black American tunnel hog digging tunnels in New York City in the early 20th century that are later inhabited decades later by his homeless grandson, the legendary Soviet ballet dancer Rudolf Nureyev, a Roma poet living in post-World War II Europe who's expelled from her community after her poems are published without her permission, legendary tightrope walker Philippe Petit, Frederick Douglass, a Palestinian father and Israeli father who you mentioned earlier, who both lost a child to violence and formed a profound friendship, Diane Foley, the mother of James Foley, the journalist who was slain by ISIS in Syria, and now the Irish journalist embedded on the undersea cable repair ship in Twist. So tell me about how these, what seem almost like obsessions to me, begin with these kernels of a story or these germs of a story, and then how does it evolve through the research, through the writing, through the, through that whole process. And something that Jamie and I were talking about earlier is how does the form start to evolve alongside of that? Because something that your work is also famous for is being very experimental in terms of form. A paragon having 1,001, you call them cantos, which could be a 4 or 5 page first-person testimony from one of these fathers, or it could be a 2-sentence quote from a medieval scholar, or a line from a Borges story, or who knows, some data from a satellite that's dropped in there. So how does all of that, where does the germ come from, and then how does it sprout and evolve?
I don't know.
Fair. A writer I know once said to me that one of the most courageous things you can say is, I don't know. His name is Colum McCann.
I do think I don't know is a really good answer, because I really don't know. And I don't know where all of these things come together. But I also think I don't know is really good to say right now, because I think a lot of us are afraid to say it. And we're afraid to stand up and say, I honestly don't know. And you and I talked about this.
Yeah.
And you have the phrase that I actually used.
Yeah, I've got it written right here.
Right. So this wouldn't come out of my mouth, but it came out when I'm writing, which is a different headspace. Yeah.
Well, so this is under the headline that I've written here: moral and ethical engagement versus political commitment and polemic. So we'll just skip that last one, I guess. Maybe we can come back to it. But so one thing that I think about a lot reading your work is that there's a sharp and I think very difficult to discern line between moral and ethical engagement and political commitment and propaganda. So if any of you are lovers of Latin American literature, you're probably familiar with the term comprometido, committed, which is a word that a lot of writers started to adopt about themselves in the 60s and 70s to signal that they were hardcore aligned with leftist international political causes. There was another group of writers who said, I'm not down with that, including Julio Cortázar, and well before them, people like Albert Camus, people like James Baldwin said, I can't go there with you. Your certainty is troublesome to me. Your certainty about ideology, etc., is troublesome to me. So Toni Morrison, Svetlana Alexievich, Milan Kundera, these are all people whose work resonates with yours in my mind, because I think all of you are able to be very morally and ethically engaged and artistically free without ever committing yourselves to an ideology or a political line. And we were talking about that, and in that context, years ago, you said, unspeakable things are happening in a world that's drowning in certainty. And that sometimes the most courageous thing you can say is, I don't know. And I wonder if you could just expand on that a little more for us.
Yeah, I would like to, and thank you. We are drowning in certainty. And the way I like to think about it is that there are, it's not just two sides to things. There are so many more than two truths or two sides. But if we just take it for a moment in that simple aspect, think about these canals that are being dug, and these are canals of certainty. Now, canal is a very interesting thing because it's a man-made thing and it goes from one place to the next. It's not a river. You don't have the theory and practice of rivers operating when it comes to a canal. And these canals, when we get to them, get deeper and deeper and deeper with their own absolute certainty. And very few of us are able, after a while, to climb out of the canal and to enter the floodplain that exists between those two particular canals, though there's probably many more than two, probably many more than 200, in fact. But our ability to get out of the canal of certainty is possibly the most important thing that we can eventually engage with. I realize I'm talking, I'm kind of lecturing, and I don't mean to be pompous, but I think we're at such a critical time that I think people have got to stand up and say these sort of things. That these canals of certainty are the things that are eventually going to drown us. And the way to get out of them is to enter the floodplain where there is some form of messiness, where it's muddy and sticky and maybe uncomfortable and sort of full of doubt. I really like this idea that we can begin to embrace this form of doubt as a positive thing, where we say, I don't know, and that's actually a really good thing, and we don't have to explain ourselves. And in so doing, I think what we're actually asking ourselves to do is to not be didactic, not to be moral, not to be churchy, not to be, ex-political thing, but to be those people who embrace the sort of real messiness of the human heart, which is what Faulkner talked about back in 1950, where he talked about the human heart in conflict with itself and all those issues of love, pride, pity, sacrifice, compassion, and so on. And a lot of people can listen to that sort of thing and say, well, that's a load of shite, or that's really sentimental. But I am prepared. I am very prepared to wear my heart on my sleeve and to stand up for the value of what I believe is the most important thing that we have going on around us right now, which is listening and telling stories and the value of literature. And it's amazing to think that we can come out and talk about this, but you know what? The writer used to, or the artist in general, used to be in a more powerful position than she or he happens to be right now. And nowadays, you got to work out of a reckless inner need, and that kind of gets my nostrils dilated. It's like, yeah, okay, I can fucking take this on. And so part of what the answer to the previous question is that I've done a lot of different things and I haven't stayed in one territory and I've been moving around a lot. But the common denominator in all the stories is how do we find some little pinpoint of hope in all that pretty dark stuff that's going on. And so I just feel that as a writer, as journalists, as poets and playwrights, that we got to go to a very dark place, but it's our job to retrieve something more than the the actual dark, only the dark that's there.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting what you said earlier, when you were talking about meeting other people and connecting with other people, you talked about listening. The phrase you often hear is we need to talk to each other more.
Right.
But you talked about listening to each other more.
Right.
And I think there's a really, really important distinction there, because a lot of the ways that we talk to each other now is actually talking at each other with pre-written lines, that it's as if we're running through this script. And where do we get that script from? Well, we get it from canals. The Spanish word for channel is canal. So Fox is a canal. Fox News is a canal. MSNBC is a canal. Your favorite podcast is one too. And we learn how to talk about the world through these people who basically tell us what we need to say. Another thing that you said to me once was that propaganda, which is what all of that stuff is, builds walls, but storytelling builds the fragile tissue of connection. And storytelling, I think a lot of people who don't write or who've never tried to write, or maybe just little kids or whatever, they think that fiction, for example, is a matter of pure invention. You just have this stuff in your head. But you are an incredible example of somebody who goes out into the world and does a hell of a lot of listening before you sit down and begin to write. In fact, you've even said that all of these years later, after publishing how many novels now? 6?
14, so we're 8 novels, 14
8 novels
books.
and 14 books. You still consider yourself actually a journalist at heart.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So journalists we talk to people, but mostly what we do is talk as little as possible and try to listen, which is hard. So talk to me a little bit about that. Talk to me about the difference between listening to each other and talking to each other. What do we learn when we focus on listening?
It's a great question,
Because
because
doors open.
so Rami, who's the Israeli man who lives in Jerusalem, he drives a motorbike, and he has on the gas tank of his motorbike, "It will not be over until we talk." And the two of them together, they travel around the world after having lost their daughters, and their message is, look, we don't have to love each other. We don't even have to like one another, though we hope that we could. But if we don't understand another, then we are well and truly doomed. And I think this is a very simple message, but nothing is simple, especially simplicity. And it's so powerful that it gets ignored, and the forces around it want to suppress it, because they want fear, because fear makes money, and fear gets land, and fear creates settlements, and all of these things. So when I think about these ideas that you're asking me about, I think that one of the most important things is that we get to tell the story that is complicated, but not absolute. And so when I meet these people who say these profound things, I wish to God I could bring Rami, Elhanan, and Bassam Aramin into this hall tonight, because I know they would change your hearts, change my heart, or align with your hearts in all sorts of incredible ways. But guess what? They can't get visas. Neither of them can get visas to come to this country. What is that about? There are a lot of things going on that we need to sort of investigate and talk about. And so when I go into all this maelstrom, into all this turbulence, I'm going to tell you something that I think is entirely true. Writers are not very smart, right? They're not. We're really not all that smart. But really good writers are tenacious, and they hang in there, and they say, this story needs to get told. And then the best writers are the ones that don't make up your mind for you, but present you with something into which you sort of drift, and then somehow your own mind. The most respectful writers will not tell you how to think. And it's a real dilemma for me nowadays, because I get up and I'm telling this sort of stuff, telling people like how they maybe should think. But I think everybody I meet is so much smarter than me. When I went to the high school today, Kelly's there. Hi, Kelly. Right? And I listened to those students. They're 15, 16 years old. They had things to say to me that would I could listen to for forever and ever. And I think we have to have a sort of humility in relation to this. And then something also important, which is not really addressing your question, but we have to look after our teachers. I mean, we really do. So I travel on United Airlines to come here a few days ago, right? And they get up on their tannoys and they say, anybody in military uniform or active military duty, get on the plane first. Cool. I'm very happy with that. I think some of these people are
as a military veteran.
Yeah. Well, okay, but that's all right. But I'm not going to argue against it. I'm not going to base my argument on being against that, because that doesn't work. I'd rather embrace that, right? But I can't wait till the day. Can you imagine it happening, that you could take up your teacher's card or your active teacher's union card or whatever and get on the plane first?
I fully support this.
Yeah. But here's the thing, we talk about being on the front line, right? And especially when you talk about where this administration happens to be right now, they're talking about front lines and bringing it indoors and everything. I'm not going to get absolutely political about this. But look, honestly, the teachers are on the front line. Why aren't we looking after them? Why aren't we paying them more? Why aren't we giving them better pensions? Why aren't we saying that this is the most important thing? Like, seems elementally like proper and correct to me. Now, how am I, as a novelist, gonna engage with that? Again, I don't know. Maybe I'll write a story about a teacher and she's down in, say, eastern Kentucky and she's living in a holler, and my friend Evan will know this, he knows who I'm talking about Mary Sloan. I see these heroic people in different parts of this country who are fighting against some of the stuff that's going on, and we're not looking after them, and I wish we would.
I completely agree with that. I absolutely do. And I know there are a lot of people in this room do as well.
Yeah.
It's one of the wonderful
But
things about this town.
if I'm preaching to the choir, then somehow convince somebody who's not part of the choir that this is true.
Well, let's talk about how you're actually doing that, because you said as a novelist you don't know how to approach this problem, but you're not only approaching it as a novelist or a writer. You are not someone who's only morally and ethically engaged through your art. You're also somebody who's going out into the world in a pretty aggressive way to try to bring people together from vastly different backgrounds around literature and to do art together in public with all of the possibilities that entails. And so Narrative 4 is what I'm talking about. This is the nonprofit that Colum started.
Evan, where are you? Oh, there he is, back in the room. And he's the man who has all the information later on about Narrative 4.
So Narrative 4 is a fascinating project that I encourage all of you to look into. And one of the things that they do is they bring students together around a work of literature, and often they bring students together who are very different from each other. So for example, students from a rural place in Kentucky and students from the South Bronx in New York City come together in the same place to talk about a work of literature. And I've been thinking about this over the last few days. And I remembered I took an Irish literature course in college, which was one of the best courses I took. And one of the things that stuck with me is the professor was this guy, Victor Luftig, who for some reason became from New York City.
Victor
Luftig.
Teaching Irish literature?
Teaching Irish literature.
Thanks God he didn't call it British and Irish literature.
So he told us about when he studied in Ireland when he was doing his PhD, and he said, you wouldn't believe it. He said, one of these poets like Karen Carson or somebody like that comes out with a new volume of poetry and they publish the poems on the front page of the newspaper. And then they have a reading and they sell out the same stadiums that U2 plays. And I was like, whoa, that's cool.
He was lying to you.
He was lying. But the first part was true. The first part was true. They published it on the front page.
The first part.
So, and people know poetry. People know songs. People. There is a language that people speak together, and poetry is still something that people read out loud. It's still music. It's called a canto because that's a song. A poem and a song are the same thing. And somehow we've lost that in our literary culture for the most part here in the United States. And I see what you're doing as a very important gesture towards making literature and the arts something that we do in public together again. And so I want you to tell me a little bit about how Narrative 4 got started, but really what I want you to tell me about is what you were talking about the other night, about what you've seen in these classrooms when these kids are together. And I want you to think about that thing you said, that storytelling is our most essential democracy, with a small d. What do you mean by that?
So I had this really amazing couple of evenings in Colorado 13 years ago. This woman, a very good friend of mine, called Lisa Consiglio, brought all these artists together. Some of whom you know. Terry Tempest Williams was there. Hands for Terry Tempest Williams. Toby Wolfe, Ishmael Bea, Darrell Burke, all of these people got together. There were 15 of us. And the question was, what is the highest aim of storytelling? And we got around, we talked about this for 3-4 days. We talked about Plato, we did Aristotle. I didn't know a damn thing about any of these people. I thought Plato was something that you actually put in your hands. But honestly, it was an incredible journey. And then we got together, we went up into the mountains, we went into a chalet, and we said, well, it has to be about empathy, but empathy is not about just telling our story, it's about listening to the story of somebody else and then maybe inhabiting that other person's story. And so we came up with this formula that was like, you tell my story, I tell yours. And then so myself and Elliott would tell each other a story that was important to us. We would get back into a group and I would say, hi, my name is Elliott, and when I was 17 years old, and you would say,
my name is Elliott, and when I was 17 years old, my name is Colum.
Yeah.
My name's Colum.
Yeah.
Hi, Colum.
And do you know what that does to the brain? It's amazing. So when you tell your own story, the brain is like a big circus, right? It's great. It's like got all sorts of things, memory, imagination engaged, all this crazy stuff. But when you tell somebody else's story, the brain is a carnival 10 times over. They've studied this stuff. And so we began to realize that maybe part of what should happen is that we should all try to step into somebody else's shoes. But in gracefully stepping into somebody else's shoes, you tell your own story at the same time. So, Elliott brought up Eastern Kentucky and the South Bronx. That's only one of the thousands of programs that we run in America and across the world. But guess what? These kids from Eastern Kentucky and the South Bronx get together in the same room. These kids are white, these kids are black, these kids are blue, these kids are red, these kids are urban, these kids are rural. And guess what? They're completely terrified of one another. They actually cry. I've seen grown boys, gang members, cry when they thought that they had to talk to somebody that was across the room that was different from them. Until they got into a story. Now here is the thing. The beauty of all of this, and the reason we're up here talking tonight, is it's because it's about personal storytelling. It's not about being didactic. It's not about being, somebody who's laying down the rules. It's about telling an honest story from your life, and then the other person looking at it and telling it back to you. And what happens is, we go into schools now, and test scores go up, absentee levels go down, levels of empathy go up, and the kids actually like one another. And during the pandemic, the kids from Kentucky were completely upset by a news report that a principal in the South Bronx had died from COVID. And they were out of their minds thinking that it might have been the principal that they had met. And it wasn't, thankfully, but the emotion was there. And isn't that amazing? And isn't it amazing that we can possibly do this stuff? But we have to be very much together on all of this. And also you have to risk embarrassment. Because do you know how many people laugh at me, certainly in intellectual circles, and say, but that's just sort of airy stuff, that's sort of kumbaya. And I'm like, no, because I would rather be, as Jim Harrison would have said, right, the person, not sitting in the corner as the lazy cynic sitting in the corner, sort of celebrating himself. I'd rather be sort of embracing life and making mistakes, and maybe, just maybe, understanding some other person.
Okay, so it's like you were there when I was preparing these questions, because I was reading your introduction to, Colum wrote the beautiful introduction to the first volume of Jim Harrison's complete poems, 3-volume hardback. And in that introduction, you talk about how Jim Harrison was a poet who avoided sentimentality like the plague, but not sentiment. That he wasn't afraid to feel, and he wasn't afraid to put that feeling on the page. And as a writer myself over the years, I have been increasingly on an almost exponential curve bored with and turned off by a very fashionable form of cynicism. And really, I think we should just call it by its name, nihilism, which I think is cowardly. I think cynicism is intellectual suicide and moral suicide as well. And my hero, Albert Camus, felt the same way, and I wrote a wonderful essay about it.
I actually think cynicism is sentimental in itself.
It's self-indulgent, for sure. So, David Foster Wallace, in 1993, 2 years before your first novel came out, wrote an essay called E Unibus Plurum, in which he made the case that postmodernism, which started with the best of intentions, had slid into a kind of poisonous form of self-indulgent irony and had reached the point of emotional evasion and moral emptiness and a kind of kitschy, highly marketable pop culture cynicism. When I read writers like you, and when I try to write my own work, I try to emulate writers like you and my heroes like Slobodan Alexievich, who I mentioned before. I feel like I'm reading an antidote to that kind of attitude, which I think has a lot to do with our susceptibility, it's a comorbidity that has a lot to do with our susceptibility to this politics of division. It makes it easy for us to turn against each other, but even more, it makes it easy for us to just turn off and say, oh, I don't really care, fuck it, That's death, that's the end. So your work, to me, is an antidote to all of that. And you said once, we have a duty to hope in spite of all the evidence before us. And I just want you to talk a little bit about that duty.
Right. Thank you. Who knows Osip Mandelstam? A few people. Russian poet. Ended up being shipped off to the gulags. And, his wife, Nadia, remembered all his poems, and his poems are still around because she remembered them. Stalin tried to destroy them all. Anyway, he said this amazing thing. He said, but we must love this poor earth because we have not seen another. So basically he's saying, this is what you've got. So you can go and you can be, as dark as you want to be, and you can, say that we are, exponentially bad to one another and so on. Or you can say, yes, that's the truth, but this is the world that we have, and we haven't seen another. So take it and do something with it. Now that does, verge on the sort of, nostalgic sort of thing. But I think it's also really muscular, because guess what? I think, when I'm talking about stories, people think, oh, wonderful stories. But stories are dangerous. Stories can take your house away. Stories can take your identity away. Stories can take your country away. Stories can send your kids to war. These things are really, really, really possibly dangerous too. And so what we're engaging in is something that's really powerful, and that we must somehow get a grip on. So how do we get a grip on it? I don't know. As a teacher, you get a grip on it. As a carpenter, you get a grip on it. As a police person, you get a grip on it. Certainly as a writer, I want to try to get a grip on it. And what I want to write about is things that are going to surprise the living daylights out of people, knock them off their comfortable balance, and get us back to a place where we start to talk to one another. Is that happening right now? No. Does the fact that I'm a failure at this mean any difference? No. It doesn't matter to me. Even if I'm going to be failing at it, I'm still going to keep on going, because it's the only thing I can do. I must love this poor earth because I haven't seen another. Eventually, and I'm going to say this is very important, I think. Eventually, all this stuff stops. If you talk to Rami and Bassam, right, who have seen the worst of human instinct, not only over the last couple of years, but over the last couple of decades. Bassam spent time in prison. Rami went to wars. They will say to you that this war that we're currently seeing will eventually end.
Mm-hmm. It will.
Has to end. That's not even a question. It's how it ends that is the real question. Look, 20 years after the Holocaust, there was an Israeli embassy in Bonn, and there was a German embassy in Tel Aviv. Who can believe that? Right? Our relationship with Japan after those horrors that were unleashed changed. All this stuff has got to eventually stop, but it's how it stops and where it stops, and how we engage with the people who are forcing us into these new situations that the writer, at the very least, must engage with. But I actually believe that the carpenter engaged with, and the police person engaged with, and the farmer does too. But we have to believe that our lives matter, and where we are matters, and what we say matters, even if everybody just sort of laughs at us and sort of says, "You're a man talking about stories." What a load of shite. The pulse of hope. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, do you know the writer Fergal Keane?
Fergal Keane.
Yeah.
I worked with him in the Irish press.
Okay.
He is a brilliant journalist. Went to Rwanda, did all these incredible things. Yeah, he's great.
So Fergal Keane is an Irish journalist and a wonderful writer who worked for many years for the BBC.
But he worked for the Irish papers first.
Worked for the Irish papers first. And he covered the Rwandan genocide. And after covering the Rwandan genocide, he had a personal crisis. He was an alcoholic and really went down hard. And when he got back up eventually, he said, "I'm not going to go to the wars anymore. I'm not going to go to the conflict zones where things are actually on fire, where people are actually killing each other and shooting each other, because in those places there's very little opportunity for anybody to listen or talk to each other. The story is just a burning fire." And he said, "I'm only going to focus my work on the places that haven't gotten to that point yet, and on the places that are picking up the pieces after the war inevitably ends," which it always does. And I actually read his autobiography, his memoir, when I was going to Afghanistan a lot. I lived in Gaza City for a year and a half. I covered Iraq, I covered Afghanistan, Myanmar, Central Africa, and I read that memoir. And I thought, I think that's what I want to do. I think I want to go there before it gets to that point. And then after people are picking up the pieces, when they have to come up with a new story to tell. And so we are deeply in need of some new stories in our country, in our world right now, but in our country and in our town. We are deeply in need of some new and very creative ways of telling the stories about who we are and how we connect to one another. And I want to just get back a little bit to the flaring nostrils, because this is exciting work. It feels like something that we can do. In a world where so many options are closed to us, so many things are impossible. Like, you can't really take on Elon Musk. You can't really take on the political establishment in your own personal little sphere of influence, but you can tell a different story. And you can say hi to somebody in line at the supermarket. And you can go to a dance party. And you can make connections with people. You can go watch your friend's band play, or stop and listen to those high school kids who hang out on our walk. You can do all that stuff. And it's real, it's meaningful. Italo Calvino has this story in Invisible Cities where every connection between two people creates a string between their houses. And the city only ends when the strings become so dense that people can't move anymore. And it's a social fabric. So, but with regard to the flaring nostrils, another thing Colum once said to me, I wrote down a lot of things that he said to me because he's very quote-worthy. You said, literature becomes a weapon in the hands of a great writer, but it's a weapon of grace. And you reminded me of your countryman, the Nobel Prize-winning poet Seamus Heaney. In his poem Digging, who has this great metaphor, he says, he's writing about his father digging peat, and obviously in the time of the Troubles in Ireland. And he says, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests snug as a gun.
I'll dig with it.
I'll dig with it. So I want you to tell me about literature and art as weapons of grace.
Okay, well, thank you.
And that's the last question.
And I do want to dilate the nostrils of everybody out there and ask you to come up with a question or two, because this is your night as well. So if you have any questions, we'll get into that. My father cut more turf in a day than any other man in Toner's Bog. That's another line from that amazing poem. I wouldn't be a very good fighter. I wouldn't be a very good carpenter. I wouldn't be a very good policeman. I wouldn't be able to do a lot of things. I'm very lucky because I grew up in a place and I grew up in a family where the story was respected. The stories of other people were respected too. Ireland is a bit of a mess right now, but it's not as much of a mess as it is over here. And we should look to places like Ireland, I think, to see how we can repair a lot of the things that are going on. But the writing pen is so much more powerful than the gun. And I think we learned that in Ireland. It's been 27 years since the Good Friday Agreement was signed. It was considered impossible, but the word possible exists within the word impossible. I am very proud, that in my mother's lifetime, when she's 98 and a half years old, she has seen us swing from this horrible war that was going on to this era of peace. Is it fully there? No, it's not fully there. Will it ever fully be there? I don't know. But I do believe that the pen, as Seamus says, is the thing that you can actually dig with. But the pen really belongs to a lot of people. And one of the things about Seamus Heaney was he was great. He was kind. He was generous. He's a Nobel Prize winner, and people would go up to him all the time and say, "Oh, Mr. Heaney, it's a pleasure to meet you. I love your books." And there's nothing else to say from there, right? There's nothing, and so most writers would say, "Oh, thank you very much. Let me sign your book." But Seamus would say something like, "Oh, I love your shoes. That's an interesting color top. Oh, that's a really interesting accent. Where are you from?" He engaged with people because it wasn't about him. It was about others. And I think if we can inculcate, is that the right term? That sort of atmosphere in our schools and amongst our young people, and if we can do things that, like what we're talking about tonight, which are very optimistic but not impossible, I think we have some measure of hope on the horizon.
We have to hope, in spite of the evidence.
That's it.
We have a duty. Okay. Questions from the audience?
Thank you.
Aaron.
I can ask this, but when you list all of the multiplicity of characters that you put into your books, how do you deal with you're going into different cultures, different ethnicities? How do you work through the imposter syndrome with that?
That's a great question, and I'm very happy to engage with this. Look, about in the early 1980s, we're talking about the question?
Yeah, repeat the question.
Imposter syndrome. Go on.
Aaron, do you want the microphone? Here.
Oh yeah.
Basically, the question is, he writes all these characters, different ethnicities, different countries, and so my question is, how do you deal? It's audacious. How do you deal with your feeling of imposter syndrome when writing about places and people that are very different from you?
Right. So this is all about cultural appropriation and imposter syndrome. And guess what? In the 1970s, in academic institutions around this country, people who were very much at the edge started talking about these ideas. People thought they were completely crazy all the way through the 80s and the 90s until the argument started to gain some thread. And what they were saying is that writers, artists, but in particular corporations and politicians, would go into places and that they would appropriate and then would make these things theirs. And guess what? These people were entirely right. Because writers have gone in, artists have gone in, corporations have gone in, and they have condescended to, they have patronized, they have stereotyped, they've done all these things. This is absolutely true. But at the same time, and this is like Niels Bohr, the scientist, saying that at the far end of one good argument is another good argument that is equally true. At the same time, there is a way to go into a culture with your head bowed, humble, saying, I don't know, I need to know, and if I can learn from you, I can go back to my culture and increase the lungs of my culture by engaging with your culture, and you will help me change things around. What my friend, the Jamaican novelist Marlon James says, and I think it's true, because what he says is relatively simple, but it's entirely true. He says it's only about honesty. Some of it's about money, yeah, right? Because you go in and you try to profit from this. But really, if you're honest and you go into another place and you're fascinated by another place and you come back and you pay respect to that other place, then it's okay to do it. Look, I understand. We're kind of out of it now. But a few years ago, look, I even wrote Twist from the viewpoint of an Irish journalist male who drinks a couple of bottles of wine a day, right? That's me. No, it's not entirely me. But I was scared. I'm being honest with you now. I was really scared, even after writing A Paragon, which was a big book, went to Israel and Palestine, that I might have to come indoors, put the GPS down, lock it down on my imagination, and be me for a while. And that's kind of what happened. But I also think that there are fashions and fads in all of this, and it's changing right now. But the real obvious current through all of this is that you have to be honest, you have to be true, and you have to be good and kind to the people, to your characters, even if they're characters that you might not like.
And it's also never going to be perfect. You're going to get stuff wrong, and
Yes.
you're not the only person who's ever going to do the story. You know, you're not. If you're standing in the way of other people doing the work, that's one thing, but that's pretty rare when you're an artist. But another question, Keegan?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, you talked a lot about listening to different kinds of people and then the importance of listening in this time. And I wanted to ask you how you have practiced listening with people who hold sort of core fundamental value differences from you. So like, I don't know, due process, or any of your core values, the things that make you want to tell these stories. When you encounter somebody else who holds very fundamentally different values, how are you practicing engaging with them and holding yourself?
I just hate them.
Oh, great. So no listening then. Clear.
No, seriously. I mean, it's not about forgiving or any of that stuff, because that's really stupid and sort of pedantic, and also like trying to tower over people as if you're cleverer than them. I think part of it is just going in there and kind of respecting them, even if you don't agree with what it is that they're saying. And I think that if we listen to them, that the universe, this sounds very woo-woo, but the universe will allow them to change as much as you want them to change. I often think, I took that bicycle journey I told you about. I went from Boston down to the south. I went through Georgia, I went through Florida, I went through Mississippi, I went through Alabama. And I met such incredible hospitality. And I'm really scared, if I got back on a bicycle today, I'd be a little slower. But if I got back on a bicycle today, would it be the same place? Or would I just friggin' hate it? Would I hate the flags? Would I hate the guns? Would I hate the people who want to tell me what they want to know? And I have a secret hope that maybe it would be all right. And I actually think that in the deep end, we're still all there in that particular place. Something else has happened to us that I can't quite put my finger on. But I think it's my job to respect that person, whether she be a mother or whatever, or a father, and that point of view that they're having, and to try in whatever way I can, not to be changed by it, but to maybe respect it. I don't have a very good answer for what's a brilliant question, and it is really the burning question of where we happen to be.
3 cheers for Colum McCann, everyone. The Elk River Arts Lectures.